Welcome to Law Awareness Weeks at CDC 2024. Law Awareness Weeks at CDC 2024 is part of a webinar series in collaboration amongst Pro Bono SG, the 5 Community Development Councils, National University Faculty of Law, Singapore University of Social Sciences, School of Law, Singapore Management University School of Law, the Singapore Corporate Council Association Pro Bono Chapter, and the Singapore Association of Social Workers, supported by the People's Association. I am Tseng, and I am your host for this webinar. And today we will be dealing with combating pollution towards a greener and better Singapore. I'm joined by 2 esteemed panelists, but before we get to their introductions, I'd like to deal with a few housekeeping related matters. Today we will be using Pigeonhole Live for our Q&A. You can submit your questions at any point during the webinar, and also upvote any questions that might interest you. If you have a smartphone or a tablet, just launch your internet browser and enter www.pigeonhole.at and enter the passcode LAWCDC2405 as shown on the slide. Alternatively, you can click on the link shared in the chat function to launch Pigeonhole live on your device. If you are viewing this webinar on your device or laptop, you should receive an invitation to launch Pigeonhole. Next, please note that today's webinar is not intended to substitute legal advice and any form of professional legal advice. If you require specific advice, then please consult a lawyer. All right, with that, I would like to introduce our panelists for the day, Professor Lye Lin-Heng and Koh Min Ee. Emeritus Professor Lye Lin-Heng taught land law and environmental law at NUS for many years. She obtained her LLB honors from NUS and holds master's degrees from King's College London and Harvard University. She was former Vice Dean and Director of the faculty's graduate program. She was Director of the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law, or APSL, from 2013 to 2018. She initiated the university's multidisciplinary program, the Masters of Science Environmental Management, or MEM, in 2001, and chaired its Interfaculty Program Management Committee from its inception until her retirement. Environmental law is a core module in this program. She also taught an intensive course on comparative environmental law for many years at the Yale Environmental School. She was a member of the Ministry of Environment's Committees on Environmental Education and on Waste Minimization and Resource Conservation in the revised Singapore Green Plan 2012, as well as a member of the Technical Committee on National Drinking Water Quality Standards NEA. She was awarded the Public Service Medal PBM in 2016. Professor Lye is on the advisory board of APSL, WWF Singapore, and the Nature Society of Singapore. Mr. Koh Min Ee has 20 over years of experience working in the environment and infrastructure sector in the Singapore government. Over this time, he has covered several diverse areas of work in the National Environment Agency, spanning pollution control to meteorological services, and under his current portfolio, he oversees a range of policy issues under the Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment. These include vehicular and industrial emissions, waste management, recycling, as well as public health. His academic background is in chemical engineering and also completed a master's in environment management, both of which were completed at NUS. Prof. Lye, Min Ee, a real pleasure. Thank you for joining us today. All right. We start off by providing a brief overview of the context of pollution in Singapore. Now, Singapore is remarkable for how it managed to industrialize into the first world country that you see today over a span of no more than 1 generation. Now, it has managed to do that by avoiding most of the pollution that is often associated with this kind of rapid development. So we will be talking about the laws that have helped put Singapore into that position, but also deal with some of the laws that are now emerging to deal with emergent issues of pollution, because pollution is not resolved because of the ways in which we consume is also evolving. We now need new laws, new ways of tackling all these emerging issues. Now, to help situate us as to how we came to be, perhaps I'll start with Professor Lye. Maybe you can help take us down memory lane as to Singapore's pollution history and how we actually turned this around.
Thank you, Sean. It's a pleasure to be here and to share my experience growing up in Singapore many years ago. I was born in 1950, right at the middle of the century, and Singapore was very different then. In terms of biodiversity, of course, it was very rich. And that's how I became interested in the environment. But we had many, many challenges. There was air pollution. I still remember as a kid dreading to go into the city because I would smell the gas from the Kallang gasworks. It was so strong. Our rivers, especially the Singapore River, Rocho, Kallang rivers, they were virtually dead. You can see quite often bloated animal carcasses floating. Of course, there was always a lot of garbage in the rivers. And later, it had to be cleaned up. And I can go into some detail later if we have time. On top of that, I consider it a privilege to have had friends who lived in the kampongs. They didn't have piped water. They took their water from wells, and the kids, had to bathe in the standpipes, water from the standpipes. We had challenges with malaria, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, rabies, because we were a poor developing country. There was malnutrition. I remember my dad warned me not to pet the stray dogs because in case they had rabies. We had mosquitoes and flies and cockroaches aplenty. And later when I talk about food security and basically, food health, cleanliness, there's an experience that always haunts me when I bought rojak many years ago as a kid, maybe since I'll just share, I was just a little girl and we had itinerant hawkers, passing outside my house. And I went to buy rojak. And this guy, he was cutting cucumber that had little worms wriggling in it. I could see it. And, he very quickly cut it up. And of course, it was all mixed up with the rojak sauce. But that was what we were then. Of course, I didn't dare to eat it. But there were no laws regulating safety of our food and the quality of our food. And of course, talking about sewage, not many houses had modern sanitation. And the people in the kampong, they would have to do their unmentionables in buckets. And there were what we call night soil collectors who would collect the feces. So the public toilets were either non-existent or absolutely filthy. There was a lot of litter. People were spitting. And all these had to be regulated in the course of time. And to the credit of our government, we've done an excellent job. Basically, very, very good laws. And laws are just something on paper. What I need to emphasize is the implementation of the laws. And the implementation requires a good environmental management plan and what we call governance and management. Okay, so one of the first things is to build the environmental infrastructure. So if we talk about the best example, I think would be water pollution. Many countries still have this problem today. You can have the best water pollution laws, but if you don't build modern sanitation, the people don't have a choice. They'll have to defecate into the rivers and streams. So good governance and management requires that the government builds modern sanitation systems. And the next question is, where's the money coming from? So all these, the Singapore government managed to resolve. And when we go on to talk about air pollution from vehicles, etc., we also want to look at what we call environmental taxation. Our COE and our ERP are examples, very good examples of environmental taxation, applying the polluter pays principle. So what did the government do with this money? They built the infrastructure for our MRT, good roads, etc. So this is what I mean by good governance and management and environmental management system. And our government has done that. Okay, so now we all have modern sanitation systems. We have excellent toilets. Whether we keep them clean is another matter. We must be the only country in the world that has a flush toilet law, because Singaporeans are not socially responsible, not all, right? So we still have reminders in our toilets to, not to squat on the seats, to wash our hands, right? And to keep the toilets clean. So it's a learning process. We've made good progress, but we can always do better. And I want to bring in the big picture too, the importance of modern housing and how we moved from the kampongs to public housing, the role of the HDB. How did we manage to achieve that? We have, I dare say, the best public housing system in the world. So all that we have done, something to be proud of, and it's part of the move also towards dealing with pollution issues. So maybe I'll just stop here.
Great, thanks, Prof. Lye. That was an amazing summary of the history and our evolution towards where we are today. And on that note, Min Ee, perhaps you can walk us through some of the key policies or initiatives that the Ministry of Sustainability and Environment, as we now know it, has undertaken over the years to get us to where we are today in terms of pollution.
Sure. Thank you, Sean. And thanks, Prof. Lye, for that as well. I thought that was something that I think I learned quite a bit from that sharing as well. Honestly, I was born in the 70s, and I think it actually also coincided with the cleaning up of the Singapore River. So I do have memories of when I was very little that the Singapore River was really covered in rubbish. And as I grew up, it slowly cleaned up. So I guess I did witness some of that transformation as well. And really I think I should start off by acknowledging Prof. Lye as one of my lecturers and teachers when I was taking the MEM course a couple of years back as well. So thanks, Prof. Lye, for everything that you taught me over the years. So to go back to the question that Sean mentioned, I think Prof. Lye has really painted quite a vivid picture of what Singapore was like in the 60s and 70s. And I would say that in 1972, the Ministry of Environment was set up to really tackle issues such as the ones that we have just talked about. So things like pollution control, sewage, drainage, as well as environmental public health. And I believe that Singapore was one of the first countries in the world to actually set up a dedicated Ministry of the Environment back in the days. So I think you have already mentioned how we really really illustrated the problem of the Singapore River. And I think what we did or what the government as a whole did, I must say that this went beyond just the Ministry of the Environment, but it worked closely with many of the other ministries as well to really move a lot of slums out of the way. And we moved industries like pig farms away from the rivers as well, so that the waste wouldn't go straight into the river. And really, it was a multi-agency effort to clean up the river between 77 and 87 across a span of about 10 years. And in the pollutive industries were removed and rubbish was cleaned up from the river as well. And this was a mammoth effort. But I think Not just that, but there were a lot of education done as well, and people were taught not to litter. As Prof. Lai mentioned, there was quite heavy enforcement as well. So I think it's not just cleaning up the river, which could be a one-time exercise, but really educating the public to stop littering and to basically keep the river clean. Otherwise, even after you clean up the river once, it can be easy to imagine that it will lapse back into a dirty condition again if we don't take care of it. So some of the legislation that were put in place includes the Environmental Protection and Management Act, as well as the Environmental Public Health Act. So both of these serve to take care of pollution as well as public health. But I must also mention something that Prof. Lai brought up as well, which is that when she was very young, the Kallang Gas Works was right in the middle of town, and it was heavily pollutive. So what Singapore has done, not just the Ministry of the Environment, was really that we consciously sited the heavy industries away from the residential areas so that, for example, the heavy industries are all in the Tuas area or located on Jurong Island or Pulau Bukom, where Shell is located. And today you will never see something like Kallang Gas Works located right in the middle of a densely populated area. So I think these are some of the measures that may not be so visible, but if you think about it, today only the cleaner industries are somewhat situated near the residences, whereas the heavier ones are all kind of moved away. Because to some extent, the heavy industries will always emit some form of pollution, and even with our pollution control laws, we can only limit the amount of pollution that they generate. So distance is really one of the key strategies for keeping our residents safe. So, but I think we have moved quite a bit from those days, and we have new challenges as well. So I think today we have other issues to worry about, such as climate change, food resilience, like Prof. Lai mentioned, as well as water resilience. And this contributes overall to Singapore's environmental sustainability. So I think we are not quite past many of our old challenges, many of which remain relevant. But I think we also have new challenges that we need to look forward to and address for the next generation.
Great. Thanks, Min Ee. That was really informative. So historically, a bit of smart urban planning, a little bit of policy decision making, and of course, education. So let's fast forward the discussion till today, 2024. We understand that the ministry has designated 2024 as the year for public hygiene, right? And that really highlights the ministry's commitment to really raising the standards of public cleanliness and hygiene across different environmental media, including our air, including our water, including our food, right? Min Ee, can you talk us through why MSE has decided to designate this year as the year for public hygiene, as well as what are the some new policies or initiatives that the public should be aware of, and how the public themselves can be play a part and contribute, right, to raising public hygiene in Singapore.
Thanks for that. So I think, first of all, as Prof. Lai also alluded to earlier, I think public hygiene today is really a far cry from public hygiene back in the 60s and the 70s. And I think to some extent, people tend to look at public hygiene as really a hygiene issue. So I think most people think of hygiene issues in the way that if it's not there, it's very appalling to you. But if it's there, you kind of take it for granted. So its presence doesn't really add any satisfaction, but its absence is something that you would notice immediately. So I think we are somewhat at that stage. And but I think what we also want to emphasize is that public hygiene remains as important and relevant as it did a few decades ago. And it is still an important challenge as our cities, especially Singapore, become more dense and more heavily populated. So it's not just keeping our environment clean and litter-free, but it really ensures that we have a safe living environment in terms of safe food, clean air, and clean water. COVID was a good reminder of this. And so, as I said, we're not really starting from zero. Over the years, public hygiene has steadily improved, and we had a Keep Singapore Clean campaign since independence as well, to keep and to remind people not to litter. And we have it every year, the Clean and Green Singapore campaign as well, to continue to inspire people to keep the environment clean and safe. So the reason why we designated this year as the Year of Public Hygiene is really as a call and a reminder to people to maintain public hygiene and keep the place clean. Basically to galvanize a whole of nation effort to remind everyone that I think we have come quite far, but there can always be room for improvement. And this is something that we don't always drum on, but that people should just keep in mind and try to make an effort to improve as well. So you also asked what we are doing differently this year. We have several new initiatives. So we launched the Go Green SG to rally the community to take collective effort. This is on top of our other campaigns that we have launched. We have also stepped up on table littering, which is the tray return in hawker centers. Since June last year, we have stepped up enforcement, and those who don't return their trays can be fined, but we have usually not have to resort to that because people, once you remind them, they would usually do it. So one of the focus areas this year is actually clean toilets as well. As Prof. Lai also mentioned, we launched the Public Toilets Task Force this year, which is actually co-led by our Senior Parliamentary Secretary, Mr. Baey Yam Keng, as well as Mr. Andrew Kung, who oversees the Public Hygiene Council, which is actually an NGO. So the task force, which I'm also involved in as well, is actually looking at improving toilet cleanliness in 4 key areas. So once you think about these 4 areas, you realize that they are all actually interconnected issues that affect public toilet cleanliness. So one is the design and infrastructure of the toilets. How a toilet is designed actually has a great impact on whether it's kept clean or not, right? Because I think as most of us would know, if the toilet is poorly designed, you tend to knock into things, you tend to get water all over the place, and if it's wet, it will continue to remain dirty. Another is cleaning and maintenance, because I think in most cases, despite people's best efforts, the toilets do get dirty over time, especially with heavy use. So it's important to make sure that there are standards that operators can follow to make sure that the clean toilets actually remain clean, and that if it's dirty due to unavoidable accidents, it's cleaned up quickly as well. The third area is actually monitoring, audit, and enforcement. I think what we also realize is that not all operators keep the toilets clean for one reason or another. So this is where I think the regulators come in as well. And this year, the Singapore Food Agency has actually stepped up enforcement as well. So more operators or at food shops have actually received enforcement action due to dirty toilets this year. And it's something that we intend to keep on putting the pressure on as well. And lastly, I think it's really engagement and outreach. So this is really the pillar where we are looking at users of the toilet as well, because I think as users, we all realize that we have a duty to keep the toilets clean. And if a user is inconsiderate, he can very easily dirty the toilet and make it unusable for the next user. So I think this is something that takes time, and sometimes I think we also realize that people involuntarily dirty the toilets, and while that is avoidable, or that may not be avoidable, there is quite a bit of value in getting people to just take a little bit of extra effort to keep the toilets clean. So these are the 4 pillars that we are looking at. And the task force will be making recommendations probably towards the end of this year or early next year to the ministry, and we will consider how to implement some of these recommendations that the task force is making.
Perfect. Thanks, Min Ee. So turning back to you, Prof. Lai, we've heard from Min Ee all the 4 pillars and how it is that policies are being implemented. And we know it's all well and good to have good policies, good laws on public hygiene. And we've seen, laws in other countries have look very nice. But in Singapore, we do actually enjoy good public hygiene, and it's not just about laws alone. So, in your view, why do you think Singapore has gotten to the level of public hygiene that it enjoys today? And while you're at it, maybe in your experience, explain how do you think awareness about public hygiene has evolved over the years?
Thank you, Sean. That's a very interesting question. And again, it gives me a chance to share what I remember. So I remember when the flush toilet law was implemented. So I use this in my class to show the students how we implement our laws effectively. So I remember, first of all, there was a lot of publicity that I think it was like 3 months before the law takes effect. There's a lot of publicity. Okay, from on such and such a date, we will have a flush toilet law. And on that very day itself, and I remember this very well, the Ministry of Environment officers were out in full force in the different toilets, public toilets. They were dressed in plain clothes. Nobody knew that they were the enforcement officers. They actually watched people going into the toilet, listening to sounds of business being done. And then, is there a flushing sound? If there was no flushing sound, the guy or the woman who comes out is given a ticket. And this was very effective. So it's a very good example of effective enforcement. First, you must publicize it so as to raise awareness so that they know on such and such a day, this law is going to take effect. And then, you implement. Subsequently, of course, we resort also to technology. So you will have noticed that some of the toilets, they flush on their own. Some people think this is, visitors think, hey, maybe the toilet's haunted. It's flushing on its own, But we did try to put in these technologies. But now, generally, our toilets are quite clean. So it's something to be proud of, but we could do better. And again, I see in the public toilets a lot of signs, reminding people to flush, not to squat on the toilets. And I once had a friend from abroad, and she actually said, have you all just got modern toilets, seated toilets? And it was so embarrassing, that we still don't know how to use these toilets properly. Why are we squatting? I'm talking about the women. Why are we squatting on seated toilets, right? And we still have some way to go in terms of public education and social consciousness. Okay. So, well, maybe we want to talk about food safety since I mentioned that. So we've got the Environmental Public Health Act. And when the act was in force, basically all food establishments, markets and hawkers are required to be licensed. And they need to go through health checks, etc. And even licenses are required if there's a temporary fair or you're running a private market. And people who have infectious diseases are prohibited from working in the food centers or doing anything to do with food. And the markets and stalls must be kept clean and in a sanitary condition, etc. So there are lots of laws on all this, even including the vehicles that are used to be transporting your food. They has to be clean, and various penalties. So I think we've done a good job in terms of regulating our food courts and restaurants. And I remember I think you will know, even now we have a grading system A to D. But I remember when it was first implemented, I think there was also an E, because we were kids, not that young, but young enough to make jokes about it. We would just say, don't go to the establishment that's A because it stands for awful. It's too clean. It's just a joke. The one with E is probably better because it stands for excellent. It's a perverse joke among the young. But now we take this very seriously. We actually look for food establishments and restaurants with an A grade. Okay. Yeah, I think those are some examples again that I remember of our
Wonderful.
journey.
Wonderful. Yeah, so I think that provides a really good overview of how, Singapore has really completed the picture in ensuring that, public hygiene is important. We have clean food, clean toilets, right? So we're going to move away from public toilets for time being. We might come back to food later, but we're going to pivot now to air pollution, right? An equally important and pertinent issue. Back in June of this year, NTU actually published a report, and one of the staggering figures there was to say that about 135 million premature deaths have been attributed to air pollution ever since 1980, right? So that's a staggering sum. But somehow in Singapore, we have actually managed, right, to get air pollution under control, as I mentioned, being, heavily industrialized in such a short span of time, has led many other countries, right, to have to succumb to some amount of air pollution. Not that Singapore hasn't, but we have done our level best to try and keep that under control. And Prof. Lye, just staying on you, one of the unique features of Singapore's air pollution law has been its laws on vehicular emissions, right? So what can you just walk us through some of the more interesting laws that are in play to minimize vehicular emissions?
Right. Well, when we talk about vehicular emissions, I think there are two types of emissions. One would be the actual air pollutant emissions, and the second one I think would be noise, really. So, well, we have laws on this. So basically, the vehicles emissions regulations specify that all vehicles imported must conform to the emission standards spelled out in these regulations. And the emission standards are prescribed for vehicles according to their age and whether they are petrol or diesel type vehicles. Now, all new and used imported vehicles must comply with Euro 6 emission standards. And the emission test procedures are now the same as the worldwide emissions, worldwide harmonized light duty test procedure as from 1st of January this year. Motorcycles also must comply, and this is Euro 4 emission standards, and you can find this in NEA's website. Okay, and I think what's interesting is that it's an offense to use on the road any vehicle from which, and I quote, smoke or visible vapor is emitted. The driver and also the owner, who is not, if he is not the driver, shall be guilty of an offense. It's also an offense to use a vehicle that fails the minimum standards for exhaust emissions. And this would be measured when the vehicle is idling. And the measurements are for carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons. There are exceptions for registered classic or vintage cars. These are defined in the laws. And I think what's interesting is Regulation 21. The driver of every motor vehicle must stop the engine, and I quote, when the vehicle is stationary for reasons other than traffic conditions. Now, what does this mean? It means that when you're at red light, you can stop it, but you probably can't keep the engine running when you're parked in a parking lot in a mall. So technically it's an offense, right? So that's interesting. Has it been enforced? Well, in law, I think we have this de minimis principle. If your vehicle isn't really emitting anything, maybe. I'm just postulating. But we do have a law that says stationary vehicles, unless it's traffic conditions, you have to turn off your engine.
Thanks, Prof. Lye. And Min Ee, just turning to you, obviously, when we think about vehicular emissions and the laws targeted at reducing that, which Singapore, as Prof. Lye has mentioned, has quite a few unique ones. But ultimately, these laws target individuals, right? But when it comes to air pollution, we know that air pollution can be caused both by individuals as well as businesses as well. So can you talk us through some of the laws targeting businesses and what are perhaps some of the challenges in controlling air pollution from companies and businesses?
Thanks, Sean. I think you're right. The way that the ministry sees it is that the main sources of air pollution in Singapore comes from two sources. One is the industries and the other are motor vehicles. And of course, sometimes there's transboundary haze as well. And I think as far as the industrial emissions are concerned, the National Environment Agency regulates industrial emissions at source by setting maximum allowable limits for controlled pollutants with regular inspections conducted to ensure compliance. So what this means is that individual factories, when they are built, they need to design their equipment to that it will not emit pollutants above a certain level. And if by design they realize that it would, they will need to put in place mitigating measures to sort of reduce the pollutants. So examples like pollution control equipment or things like scrubbers. So basically they'll need to pass a gas through these equipment to remove some of these pollutants before it can be released to the atmosphere. So for specific pollutants such as sulfur dioxide, the NEA actually, on top of all that, imposes a cap on the total allowed emissions per year for major emitters. So this would include industries such as either refineries or power stations, because I think SO2 has a slightly more harmful effect on people as well for breathing. And as Prof. Lai mentioned, there's low sulfur diesel for vehicles. And similarly, NEA also specifies the use of low sulfur fuel for the industries as well, when they need to, say, generate power or burn stuff. So what I mentioned earlier about the design stage is actually quite important, and that is also ties into the urban planning that we spoke about earlier as well. So not only do we site them further away, but at the design stage, we make sure that they're able to comply with the pollution control requirements, because I think what we realize as well is that it is a lot cheaper and more cost-effective to design something that is compliant rather than to catch someone that is already offending and you try to force them to change their equipment or to make major modifications to comply. So that is pretty much it for the industries. So for vehicles, Prof. Lai actually covered it very well. And an interesting thing to note on what you talked about idling engines, it is true. Idling engines is something that I think the NEA enforces against as well. I think especially where there are hotspots like parents parking their vehicles while waiting for their children near the schools, and the emissions are affecting the school children there. I think sometimes people would make reports and NEA would go down to carry out enforcement on that. But I think interestingly, this does not apply to electric vehicles because apparently the engine stops when the vehicle is not moving. So the same controls don't quite apply. I think we realized that Singapore as a whole, we are moving towards electrification of our fleet. And by 2030, we'll no longer register new internal combustion engine passenger cars and taxis on the road. So I think along the way, what else we are doing is also that we have put in place VES, vehicle emission scheme system, to basically incentivize cleaner vehicles and to disincentivize the more pollutive ones. So basically, we work together with the Ministry of Transport and LTA to make sure that there's a small rebate for electric vehicles as well as cleaner vehicles, whereas the diesel ones that emit more particulate matter are actually charged a small surcharge if you insist on buying such vehicles. So I think many of these policies work in tandem, and I think we are slowly moving towards full electrification on a smoother route now. I believe the Straits Times recently reported that for the first half of this year, about 70 to 80% of new vehicles registered are either electric vehicles or hybrids. So I think we're moving towards a cleaner vehicle future as well.
Great, thanks, Minnie. And from the air, we now move on to land and talk about waste. And I'm seeing some of the questions which come in. We won't deal with audience questions till the very end, but I think some of the questions and topics that we're going to be dealing with today is already going to anticipate some of these questions. So that's great. Now, the more that Singapore's population grows, the greater likelihood that we are going to generate more waste. Singapore has only one landfill, really, and that's the Semakau landfill, which was really started back in 1999. But at the rate that we're going, it is likely that, as projections show, the landfill is going to be filled up by 2035, and that's not anything more than about 11 years from today. And so what we really need to do is now start thinking about how we're generating waste, how we're disposing of our waste. And one key source of waste in the context of Singapore is actually e-waste, electronic waste, right? And Singaporeans love their gadgets, they love their technology. But what we tend to overlook is the environmental footprint that obviously creates. So, Prof. Lye, one of the key regulatory approaches that we have in dealing with this sort of waste is to impose what we call extended producer responsibility, or EPR, right? And you can see that all around the world, right? We see that in Canada, we see that in the EU. Can you talk us through what is this regulatory approach called EPR, what that entails, and how has Singapore started to implement its own version of EPR?
Right. Thanks. That's a very important question. And let me just say right at the outset that we passed the Resource Sustainability Act, or the RSA, in 2019 to take effect from 1st January 2020. And if I may quote the preamble, the act is an act to impose obligations relating to the collection and treatment of electrical and electronic waste and food waste, to require reporting of packaging imported into or used in Singapore, and to regulate persons operating producer responsibility schemes, and to promote resource sustainability. So basically, this act focuses on 3 waste streams. The first one is electric and electronic equipment, EEE, what we call e-waste. The second, food, and the third, packaging, including plastics. So let's focus first on the extended producer responsibility, or the EPR framework. And this is for producers and retailers of e-waste. And basically, producers, basically the companies that manufacture and import regulated e-waste products, or typical e-products for the local market, are made responsible for the collection and proper treatment of the e-waste. All producers must register with NEA, our National Environment Agency, keep records of the weight and numbers of the products, and report annually to NEA. And this report must be during the first quarter of the year. There's a distinction between consumer and non-consumer products, but basically all e-waste collected must be collected by licensed collectors and sent to licensed e-waste recyclers for proper treatment. Records must be kept for 5 years. The 5 product classes that are regulated are, number 1, solar photovoltaic panels. Number 2, information and communications technology, or ICT equipment. And these include printers, power banks, computers, laptops, mobile phones and tablets, network and setup boxes, desktop monitors. The third category would be large appliances. And these are air conditioners, dryers, refrigerators, televisions, washing machines. The fourth would be batteries, and the fifth would be lamps. So basically, we've got the EPR, Resource Sustainability E-Waste Recyclers regulations. We've got a number of regulations, the in-store collection of e-waste regulations and the producer responsibility schemes regulations, all 2021. Basically, they provide that all retailers must take back from the consumer the same type of product at no extra cost. Large retailers, these are those with a floor area of 300 square meters or more, must provide in-store collection of the e-waste. What are the duties of the licensed e-waste recycler? These duties include removing all specified pollutants from the electronic or electrical product. Next, processing or treating the specified pollutants that are removed so as to prevent these pollutants from polluting the environment. Next, ensuring that all data stored in any device is permanently erased or destroyed before the licensed e-waste recycler does or allows its preparation for reuse, recycling, or disposal or transfer to another e-waste recycler. Next, provide recycling reports on the flow of regulated e-waste on a quarterly basis, including the amount that's being provided or prepared for reuse or repurposing. I think we all know that a company called ALBA, A-L-B-A, E-Waste Smart Recycling Private Limited, has been appointed as the Producer Responsibility Scheme operator for 5 years, starting from 1st July 2021 to 30th June 2026. And they are to collect regulated consumer electrical and electronic waste across Singapore for proper treatment and recycling on behalf of the producers. They are mounting quarterly collection drives in conjunction with the town councils across Singapore. And basically, you can also engage ALBA for doorstep collection for a fee.
So remember that name, Alba. All right.
Yes.
Min Ee, turning back to you, I think Prof. Lye has very helpfully given us a rundown of some of the most relevant laws under the Resource Sustainability Act. Now, in practical terms, how do you imagine retailers complying with all these laws? And can you also talk us through how consumers can also play a role?
Right, thanks, Sean. And really thanks, Prof. Lye, for that very comprehensive overview as well. I think you have actually described the scheme quite comprehensively. So perhaps I will just add on a bit. Sean was asking how consumers can play a role as well, and I think Prof. Lye actually alluded to that to some extent. So basically, I think the scheme is such that consumers have many options to recycle their waste. And one option is really that at many of these regulated outlets, like for example, your Court or Harvey Norman, which are fairly big, they will be required to have a recycling box on their premises, and you can bring your e-waste to deposit at these recycling boxes, and there's no charge to it. And when you purchase a new large appliance, very often you will need to dispose of an old one unless you are moving to a completely new place. And what the retailers are obliged to do is that they are required to take the old ones back for free. And the town councils are also required to take any of the discarded ones if you make an appointment for bulky waste disposal with them, and also send it to the recyclers. So there are now a lot of different options that consumers can actually send their e-waste to the recyclers. And I remember that in the older days, when you had to say replace an old refrigerator, you need to pay the guy a certain fee. They'll charge you $100, and I mean cheaper if they can resell it somewhere, but you usually need to pay them to sort of get rid of the old machine, whether it's a washing machine or fridge. But now I think what this does is to make it a lot simpler. You don't need to pay anyone. If you bought a new one, they're obliged to take old equipment away for free. So I think the interesting thing I felt about this way of doing things is that we are shifting towards more of a polluter pay principle in terms of these EPR legislation, in the sense that I think in the past, we kind of felt that the consumers sometimes feel a certain responsibility that if I want to discard something, I should do it responsibly. But I think the missing part is really at the back end. And for many years, I feel that certain types of waste can be economically recycled and there'll be off-takers for it. But for certain other kinds of e-waste, there is no one that would really just take it and recycle it for free. So I think with this EPR system, all the producers have a certain responsibility to actually fund the recycling and the collection of all this waste. So it's really a step forward. And I think Prof. Lai also alluded to pollutants or other dangerous chemicals in these e-waste as well. And this is something that we actually addressed a couple of years earlier as well, through a set of legislation where we adopted the EU RoHS, Restriction of Hazardous Substance legislation, where we similarly restricted the use of certain heavy metals and chemicals in electrical and electronic equipment. So things like cadmium, mercury, and lead, and several others as well, have all been restricted for a couple of years now, which I think also helps to make recycling easier and safer for the companies that actually do it.
Great. Thanks, Min Ee. And now staying on waste, and moving away from e-waste and towards another really important source of waste in the context of Singapore as well as globally is really plastic pollution, right? That continues to be an issue the world over, especially in Singapore. But, you know, not many people understand sometimes, you know, they know plastic pollution is a bad thing, but why? Why is plastic pollution a bad thing? The reason why plastic pollution can be so worrying is really because of its impact on human health and even marine life as well. In the context of marine plastic pollution, that has impacted over 267 species, right, of marine life, and a great number of sea turtles and other forms of sea animals die and suffer and suffer from dwindling populations because of plastic pollution. As for human beings, studies have shown that plastics are able to enter the human bloodstream as well. And so we're looking at microplastics, right? And some amongst the most vulnerable amongst us, fetuses and those who are newborns as well, will be sometimes found to have plastics already in their bloodstreams, right? So that's extremely worrying. And because of the, you know, occasional toxic chemicals that will be found in plastics, there is the risk of you know, prematurity, stillbirth, and birth defects. So, Prof. Lai, can you perhaps talk us through some of the challenges, right, in curbing plastic pollution in Singapore? What are some measures we should start thinking about? I mean, there's one question that we also have on the screen that talks about how do we start thinking about tackling single-use plastics as well. So, in the context of this country, how do you think we should be thinking about plastic pollution?
Thank you, Sean. Yes, this is a very real problem, and it's not easy to solve. First of all, there are different types of plastics. So it's very important that we understand, you know, how best to recycle this. But first of all, I think there's a need to raise awareness. We should, first of all, try and reduce the amount of plastics that we use. And then whatever we use, to what extent can these be recycled? And if they can't be recycled, how do we handle this? Now, we have to bear in mind that in Singapore, we incinerate our waste. Okay, so we, of course, in terms of the plastics, how does incineration work? Is it good to incinerate plastics? What plastics need not be incinerated? I think Min Ee can, you know, help us here because he's a chemical engineer. But in terms of single-use plastics, we now have a law, right, passed very recently, whereby disposable carrier bags now require the imposition of a charge minimum 5 cents. And this is good. But occasionally I see a call to ban all plastic bags. Now, this is not wise because in the Singapore context, we do need plastic bags to dispose of our waste. Okay, and that's because of our system. We live, well, 80% or more of us live in high-rise apartments. We dispose of our garbage through the garbage chutes. In the old days, even the HDB flats had individual garbage chutes. So you dispose of your waste in the privacy of your own home. How then do we monitor recycling? You know, so the whole thing is messed up. We don't know. They just throw it down. Now, in recent years, public housing as well as private apartments must have the disposal chutes outside. And there should be two, one for recyclables, one for garbage. But we still need the, what you call it, the disposable carrier bags, the single-use bags to pack our garbage. So we cannot call for a total ban, all right? At the same time, so what happens in the incinerators? So the waste is incinerated. In fact, when it contains food waste, you know, it reduces the efficacy of the incinerators, so I'm told, because it's wet waste, right? And we use the incinerators to also recover energy, right? So ideally, we should not. So there are other ways to deal with food waste. Maybe we can, you know, use them in the garden, etc. But then most of us live in apartments, right? So we have to rethink this. So the different types of plastic waste, let me ask Min Ee, how do you deal with that? You know, so we need to have a system. We need to raise public awareness, because what I notice is that when I go to these places, you know, you see, and I think it's true if you ask any of the garbage collectors, the waste is all mixed up. So, you know, we are not doing this effectively. So I think more public education is needed.
Yeah, and I think that's a good juncture to bring in Min Ee to the conversation and ask you perhaps what are some of the key laws, right, that the government has implemented over the last few years to try and deal with plastic pollution as a problem. And I think you know, Prof. Lye has already mentioned one of them, which is to impose this 5 cents per disposable carrier bag. How have all these laws been how effective have they actually been?
Thanks, Sean, and thanks, Prof. Lye. I think let me just make a quick clarification regarding the disposable bag charge. The disposable bag charge is not a blanket charge, and it applies only to large supermarket operators, and they are required to charge at least 5 cents per disposable bag provided at their outlets since July last year. So this bag charge, I think we have kind of tried to explain before, it's not so much to penalize people for taking bags, because we realize that people do need bags for things like disposing of their rubbish at flats. But it's intended more as a behavioral nudge to encourage people to bring reusable bags for the shopping and basically overall use less disposables.
Yes.
And I think, as Prof. Lye correctly pointed out, people will still need bags for rubbish disposal, and we believe that this will continue to be something that is important for public hygiene as well. So we were asked, how well is the charge doing? I think we recently reported it as well, and that we are generally encouraged to see that the bag charge has somewhat kickstarted a shift in behavior. So about 1 year on, the supermarket operators who started charging for the disposable bags in 2023 reported a reduction of about 70 to 80% in the number of disposable carrier bags that are provided to customers.
Excellent.
So notice that I said that it is those who started charging, because this doesn't include those who already started charging before that. So they will see some slightly different numbers. And a survey that was conducted by the NEA also found that more than 90% of about 1,000 respondents brought their own reusable bags for grocery shopping. So this is compared to about 60% before the implementation of the charge. So it has actually prompted a shift. Personally, I started bringing bags more consciously after the charge kicked in as well. And beyond the reduction in the number of bags used, more than a third of survey respondents also said that the bag charge has sort of nudged them and encouraged them to use less single-use disposables and plastics. So there is a slight effect that sort of expands beyond just the bags itself, that it prompts a slight shift in mindset that if I use more reusable bags, I also tend to be a bit more mindful about what other plastic disposables I use regularly. And I think something else that we didn't quite talk about, but is relevant to what Prof. Lye was saying, is another new piece of legislation that we also introduced on the beverage container return scheme. And yep, so that is something which I think many countries have already implemented, and it is essentially a small deposit on your beverage container. So if I say I buy a bottle of Coke, for example, I would have to pay a small deposit when I buy it, and when I drop it off at a recycling machine, for example, or at a counter, I would get my deposit back. So this, we hope, is something that will encourage people to recycle more. And even if, let's say, the person doesn't recycle it, someone else might pick it up and return it for the deposit. We hope that this will actually generate a clean stream of plastic recyclables that can be more easily recycled and would circumvent some of the contamination that Prof. Lye was talking about as well.
Wonderful. And I think that that's all very encouraging signs. I think ultimately we still have, still waste to deal with, right? We're still generating a lot, even if we make some savings here and there with plastic bags and whatnot. One of the key reasons we actually face such waste management issues is because of the model of our economy, and most economies, to be honest. And it's born really from the patterns of consumption that we have grown so used to, and we've adopted over time this take, make, throw philosophy, right? What we want to do is to move away from what we call a linear economy to one which is a circular economy. Right? To achieve a circular economy, one of the key measures and policies we need to start implementing robustly and in earnest is recycling, right? And this anticipates one of the questions that actually was posed up in the Q&A, which is really how we're going to start thinking about recycling. And so, Prof. Lye, perhaps I could turn to you first and ask you, what do you know about the rates of recycling in Singapore, and how do you think we can actually do better?
Thank you, Sean. Yes, it's a very important question. But I think first, before we talk about recycling, we need to reduce the generation of our waste. Okay, so if I may provide some statistics from NEA's website, our domestic waste per capita decreased by more than 15%, and non-domestic waste per dollar GDP by more than 30% over the past decade. So basically, we are doing some improvements, but we could do better. Okay, so the daily domestic waste generated per capita decreased from 1.08 kg in 2013 to 0.88 kg in 2023. So in 10 years, it went down from 1.08 to 0.88 kg, daily domestic waste generated per person. The daily non-domestic waste generated decreased from 40 tons in 2013 to 26 tons in 2023. The statistics show that paper recycling dropped from over 50% a decade ago to 31% in 2023. So our recycling for paper is not good, but apparently this is largely due to structural factors such as freight costs and commodity prices. The overall recycling rate decreased from 57% in 2022 to 52% in 2023, but largely due to the amount of construction and demolition waste. We call that C&D. Basically, construction and demolition waste is recycled almost 100%. So once you put that into your statistics, it makes our recycling rate look good, right? So now, if we exclude construction and demolition waste, the overall recycling rate in 2023 was 45%, okay? We could do better, definitely. Now, according to NEA's 2023 survey on household recycling, 72% of our households recycle. compared to 64% in 2021. So that's not bad. 8% increase in the space of 2 years. But again, we can do better. Okay. So how can we do better? Again, we need to raise awareness, etc. So maybe.
Yeah, and I think that's a good juncture to ask Minnie this question about education, right? I think one of the key things with recycling is really educating consumers about, you know, their rights and responsibilities regarding waste management. How has MSE helped with that? Are there any initiatives in the pipeline that you can talk about?
Right. Maybe I can just share a little bit about educational efforts that I think are ongoing as well. I think there are some structural issues, as Prof. Lye pointed out, some of which I think doesn't just affect Singapore, but there are worldwide implications as well. But definitely more can be done. And I think everyone has a part to play in caring for and protecting our environment. So our outreach efforts have focused on a couple of things, increasing environmental awareness and education, as well as translating the increased awareness into tangible action. So one of NEA's public education campaigns is the Say Yes to Waste Less campaign. It focuses on simple actions that everyone can take to reduce the consumption of disposables and reduce food waste, so such as buying and ordering the amount of food that you can finish, as well as bringing along a reusable bag, bottle or container whenever you go out. NEA's Recycle Right campaign separately encourages households to recycle more and to do so correctly. This is important as around 40% of the items in our recycling bins today are found to be either contaminated, like food stain containers, or not recyclable. So it could be things like soft toys or clothes. So in 2022 and 23, NEA distributed recycling boxes, which we call blue boxes, as part of the Recycle Right campaign. So by facilitating and encouraging households to set up a recycling corner in their own homes, we hope to encourage the habit of recycling at home. The blue box also has instructions printed on it to help households identify what can and cannot be recycled. So over time, we distributed more than 500,000 blue boxes through vending machines, community events, as well as schools. And NEA also recently launched a blue bin, which is what we call those blue-colored bins at HDB blocks, a chatbot for the public to easily check if the items that they want to recycle can actually be recycled. So the interactive chatbot is available on both WhatsApp and Telegram. So I think it's really a matter where everyone needs to play their part, and members of the public can start by making small and simple changes to their lifestyle. And sustainability and recycling will soon become part of everyone's daily routine as well. I think it's not something that is natural to everyone. And I think as you grow older, sometimes it's harder to change your habits. But I believe the younger ones among us, especially the school children, are a lot more conscious of this as they grow up. And we hope that more of these habits will catch on as well.
Great. And Prof. Lye, perhaps on that note, you could talk us through, I don't know, stories or case studies where waste management practices have actually been successful, not necessarily in Singapore, maybe overseas, and something that maybe we can learn from as well.
Right. Yes. But before I do that, maybe I'll just mention that I think what Min Ee says is a very good point, that the kids are learning how to recycle in school and they can inform their parents and grandparents. But I find that it will also help if we had programs on TV, perhaps, showing, you know, for example, the two types of bins and what you can put in. Right now, I don't see any of our channels having this. So I think it might be good if we could do something like that, you know, so just before a popular program, show them these are the bins, what you can put in, what you can't put in, right? And show them what, you know, contaminated waste is. So that's a suggestion. So, okay, now, talking about countries that have a good system, I was invited to go to Taiwan some years back for a conference, and we were talking about, you know, these issues, pollution, etc. Actually, Taiwan was once called the island of garbage. It was so bad. But now they have a very, very impressive record of recycling and collection of waste. And so I would just like to share that we were taken, participants at that conference were taken on a bus round Taipei City. And we were asked to look out and see whether we can see any garbage bins. And to our surprise, number one, there was no litter at all. Number two, there were no garbage bins. So how did they manage to do this? And apparently they charge for the weight, on the weight basis for garbage. So therefore they cannot have garbage bins because people would just go and dump their garbage there. So, you know, all the garbage has to be taken out from the households, and they have a very good system of collecting waste. So basically these garbage trucks come to collect waste, and they play loudly, I think, two pieces of music, Fur Alice and another one. And, you know, when the people hear this, they go down and they bring their waste, and they know exactly what to bring down on a particular day. I was told that the ladies, the housewives, etc., play an important role here in ensuring that the right type of waste is taken and brought down to the garbage collectors. And basically, if the wrong type is mixed up, you know, then the garbage collectors will not take it. So basically, the garbage is put into transparent bags so that you can actually see if it's messed up, if it's mixed up, right? And then your neighbors will be very, very annoyed with you because the garbage truck will not take from the entire condo. So this is something. There's another thing that impressed me about Taiwan. They took me to something like our community center, the equivalent. They had old men there who were repairing used items like bicycles, children's toys, furniture, old radios. These were repaired, and then every month they would sell them very cheaply to the population, to the people. And I thought, what a great idea, you know, because instead of putting it in the garbage, if it can be reused, why not, right? Right, which brings me to the third point, but I'll leave that as a parting point.
Sure, sounds
Right.
good. So, Min Ee, Prof. Lye earlier mentioned, you know, the recycling rates that we have in Singapore. Perhaps you could talk us through whether there are any upcoming policies or measures that the ministry is looking at in trying to improve these recycling rates, or even waste management in general, that we can expect.
Right. Thanks, Sean. I think Prof. Lye actually talked just now about the Resource Sustainability Act, and that we basically have three priority waste streams that we are looking at. So we have talked about two so far. So one is e-waste, and one is your plastic waste. And the third one that I think Prof. Lye mentioned, but we haven't really talked that much about, is food waste. So many of the measures that we have upcoming will be looking and targeting food waste. There are a couple of ways to look at it. So the first one is really to reduce the amount of food waste generated in the first place. And we feel that there is actually quite a bit of potential here. So one, we are looking at public engagement to really encourage the public to not generate so much food waste in the first place. So if you can, order less food, or don't cook so much food, so that you actually waste less food as well. We also work with industry stakeholders, such as the Industry Steering Committee for Circular Economy on food. And basically, a lot of the food waste is sometimes generated by the industry, and they are also keen to see how they can reduce the amount of food waste that they generate as well. Because the more food waste that they generate, the more waste that they need to take care of downstream. And downstream, we have come out with regulations as well, which is why the Resource Sustainability Act was mentioned. And the regulations that we have passed under the RSA progressively requires commercial and industrial buildings that generate large amounts of food waste to segregate the waste for treatment or conversion to useful products, and also to basically submit annual reports. So the annual reports are also important in the sense that they provide a certain amount of accountability for these companies, and it also makes them sort of force them to kind of face the amount of waste they're generating. And I think it nudges them to think of ways to do more, to either reduce the amount of waste generated or to make sure that it's properly taken care of. A somewhat related development was the Good Samaritan Food Donation Bill that was passed in August 2024. So this bill was a private member's bill that received bipartisan support. And the bill complements our existing regulatory approach by facilitating food donations. So basically food that's still edible can be donated that can still be edible, should be donated rather than just thrown away or recycled, in which case there is a lot less value that can be recovered from the food. And I think lastly, but importantly, we are also concurrently building up our food waste treatment capacity through the construction of a food waste treatment facility, which will be part of our next generation integrated waste management facility at Tuas Nexus once it's completed.
Great, thank you, Min Ee, and thank you for explaining all that, and Prof. Lye for taking us through, the Taiwan example. We've come really to the end of the moderated session, and we would like to leave some time for the audience to ask some questions, and we see that there are quite a number that have already come through. Perhaps what we can do is to deal with this one first, just so that since we are already on the topic of recycling and waste. I think the question is, what is being planned right now to more firmly enforce public hygiene, proper litter management, less burning and abandoned food during Ghost Month. So I think that touches upon some level of, cultural and religious aspects that may very well contribute to the unique landscape that is Singapore's, waste management problems and issues. Is there anything that can be done? Is that something that's sensitive? How are we thinking about that?
I can't really say that much about the Ghost Month. I think partially because it's quite temporary in nature and it happens about once a year. But I think part of what we are doing for the Year of Public Hygiene as well, in terms of littering, is that we realize that there are certain hotspots where people tend to congregate and the area experiences a lot more litter than other areas. So we identified several of these hotspots. Many of them are sometimes places where people congregate informally to smoke. It may not be illegal to smoke there, but after they smoke, they kind of throw the cigarette butts. And once people see cigarette butts there, sometimes they just litter with things like discarded drinks as well. So what we have done is really to try to identify many of these hotspots and put in place enhanced enforcement measures to try to make sure that people avoid actually littering in these hotspots. Because I think it's a bit more apparent, and I think it's really a focus of what we're trying to do in terms of littering for this year.
Great. And Prof. Lye, we've got also a question about, recycling, right? And I think the question is, would it be feasible, right, to have producers put recycling labels on their products to indicate they are recyclable, like in the way they do it in other countries? Because I think the challenge that this particular audience member is facing is that it's sometimes difficult, right, to tell the difference between whether something is recyclable or whether something is not. Is that something you see as a potential measure we could explore?
Yes, I think that's a good idea. I mean, it's important but first of all, we need to educate people on what a particular sign means, right? I think here, the certain plastic bottles have different signs telling you that, whether it can or cannot be recycled. But we need more public education, right? Min Ee, maybe can talk more about this.
Yeah, I think the idea is good, but we also need to be mindful of the context as well, because certain things are technically recyclable, but we may not have the collection facilities or the recycling facilities in Singapore to actually do it. So, for example, say textiles could be recyclable, but it could be recyclable in specific places. And if we don't have a specific collection system in Singapore to congregate it, to sort of gather all this and to send it to where it can be recycled, then it may not be as helpful. So I think, but it's a good idea. And I think what it really boils down to is still the point of public education. And I think letting people know what is recyclable here and how it can be recycled. So I think that is where we need to do a bit more work in terms of making sure that people are aware through some of the measures that we talked about earlier.
Understood. All right, so we move back into vehicular emissions. Somebody has asked a question about, this law, Prof. Lye, that you mentioned about how motorists who leave their vehicles idle, right, so long as it's not because of traffic conditions, are technically in breach of the law by leaving their engines on. And for that matter, if you do spot a vehicle that is emitting visible smoke, for example, what can individuals do, right, effectively to report on these things?
Well, I think NEA has a system, right? You can always report to them. I've tried it myself. And
yeah. So I think there are online reporting facilities available, and you can call NEA's hotline, which is 1-800-CALL-NEA, and you can report the vehicle that has idling engines. But I think I need to contextualize this a bit. So I think when you report it, someone will go and do a check. But sometimes by the time the person goes down, the vehicle may have left. So I just need to manage expectations a bit, that it doesn't mean that there is someone standing by that will reach there in 30 seconds. But I think what NEA does in this respect is that it identifies certain hotspots. So just now I spoke about schools, right, where there are sometimes parents who wait for the kids and they just basically park there and they leave the aircon on. So these are what they consider hotspots. And I think it's easier to carry out enforcement here and to make sure that where there are certain hotspots, that we make sure that those people are, the errant motorists are sort of caught, in a sense.
Understood. And I think when it comes to, engines or smoke being emitted from exhaust, it could very well be a picture, right? That's something which is a little bit more easy to sort of capture rather than idle engines, right? All right, so let's move on to the next question. This one veers a little bit away from some of the topics we've spoken today, but something which is clearly an environmental issue that has caught the attention of this particular audience member. And that question is, what is the ministry's plan to reduce emissions from companies with significant carbon footprint, right? So talking about a little bit of climate change related issues.
Right. So one of the key things that the ministry has done is really to put in place a carbon tax over the last few years. So I don't have the latest numbers with me, but I believe that the tax started off as $5 per ton a couple of years back when it first started out. And it just increased, again, if I'm not mistaken, to about $25 a ton. And this will steadily go up by 2030 to, I think we announced it to be between $50 to $80 a ton. So this increasingly will put pressure on companies, especially large emitters, to be very mindful about the kind of carbon emissions that they have. So this is separate from the pollution emissions that we spoke about earlier. And it's really a matter of, I think, energy efficiency and how much the company actually what is the carbon emissions that a company actually comes up with. So I think the carbon tax is something that has changed the calculus of many companies operating in Singapore to really think a bit more about their Scope 1 emissions and how they can actually reduce it.
Great. Prof. Lye, anything to add to that? We know the Energy Conservation Act is also one that actually been longer, it's been around way longer than the Carbon Pricing Act. But yeah, anything to add?
Yeah, I think we must always be mindful of the need to reduce our carbon footprint. right? So there's a lot going on in terms of climate change and the laws, and we can anticipate a lot more changes. I think the plus point now is that companies in our stock exchange are all required to give a corporate report on their environmental performance. So I think this puts them on their toes. And what we are concerned about is we don't want any what we call greenwashing. So because the environment is in the forefront every day, I think companies are being closely watched. So it gets better. Right.
Absolutely. And I think one of the key rationales for climate reporting is to ensure that, companies themselves reflexively understand what their own carbon footprint is. And hopefully with that informational approach of getting to understand what their own impact is, they then can appreciate, okay, I'm contributing this much, I need to now deal with it, right? And start thinking about how they can actually reduce their emissions from that perspective. All right, so we are unfortunately out of time. We have only a few minutes to go, and so I'm going to invite both Prof. Lye and Min Ee to leave us with a key takeaway or a few key takeaways. Perhaps I'll start with Prof. Lye.
Yes, I would like to emphasize this what we call the ethics of corporations. When we talk about e-waste, it's always troubled me that, with electrical implements, sometimes they just don't work. And I'm wondering, is this deliberately done by the manufacturers? So, there is something called planned obsolescence, that's being addressed now. And I would invite the audience to just Google. There's a video called The Light Bulb Conspiracy, which traces all the way back to the invention of the light bulb. At the time the light bulb was invented, very soon they found the technology to make it last a very, very long time. And apparently the big light bulb companies, decided to buy that invention and tell the inventor, don't ever do this type of light bulb, because we want to make light bulbs that don't last very long, so people will buy more. So this is what we call planned obsolescence. And I think it's important that companies do not plan to have their products go obsolete so quickly, because this adds to the mountain of e-waste, and these all go to developing countries who cannot cope with it. We have to be responsible. So I think it's very important that all corporations have a sense of ethics. It's not just about making money. You have a duty to the world, to the environment. And that's my takeaway. So do take a look at The Light Bulb Conspiracy.
Thanks, Prof. Lye. Min Ee?
Thanks, Sean. I think my takeaway really is that I think on many fronts, we have come quite a long way from where we were decades ago. But I don't think that the journey is quite complete, and we still have quite a bit more to do in terms of recycling, in terms of waste management, that I think we can all try to do a bit more in terms of public hygiene. And I am looking forward to maybe in 30 years' time, and I come on another show like this, and I can say that things are better in 30 years' time than they are today. Yeah, and I think I just saw a couple of questions that maybe I will just take one opportunity to address as well.
Sure.
I think there are a few people asking about biodegradable bags and biodegradable plastics. So this is actually something which we have looked at before as well, and I would just take this opportunity to say that the context of biodegradable plastics and bags is quite different from where we are in Singapore. And in many countries, biodegradable bags and plastics do make sense because they send their waste to landfills or composting. And the biodegradable bags then have an opportunity to actually biodegrade and basically disintegrate into the environment. But in Singapore, because we send our waste for incineration, it doesn't actually have the opportunity to break down. So in a sense, it is actually no better than your usual plastic bags in terms of the overall waste management. So maybe that's just one quick trivia that I just leave everyone with.
Great point, and really powerful, takeaways from each of you. So thank you very much. We have to bring the Q&A to a close. I would like to talk to you about just next Monday on the 7th of October at 7:30. We do have the next webinar entitled Help, I'm a Victim of Online Harassment. Is someone defaming you online or perhaps sharing intimate photos or videos of you? Do you know of someone who's being stalked or harassed online? Whether you are in one of these situations or know someone that is, join us for this informative webinar. Moderator Marco Loh and speakers Fong Wei Lee, Colin Goh, and Lorraine Lim will address topics such as cyberbullying, harassment, repeated unwanted contact violence, with a focus on explaining the legal remedies that are available and how to access them. This and many more webinars are a part of the Law Awareness Weeks at CDC 2024. You can click on the link shared in the chat to visit Law Awareness Weeks at CDC website, go.gov.sg/law-CDC to register for this webinar or the many more webinars which are available. At the end, you will see a survey form pop up on your screen for your completion. We appreciate your comments as it would be used to improve future webinars. Lastly, after today's fantastic sharing from our panelists, Prof. Lye and Min Ee, and if you find that you do need legal guidance on your legal issues, do write to help@probono.sg. We'd now like to express our sincere and utmost gratitude to Prof. Lye and Min Ee for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. With that, on behalf of Pro Bono SG, we would like to thank all of you for joining us today and have a great week ahead.